In this video tutorial, we will look at the topics of cell specialization and organization. In our previous lesson, we mentioned that nature prefers to create large creatures by putting together multiple small cells together. This creates a multicellular organism. The reason why nature doesn't like big single-cell organisms is due to the limitations of surface area to volume. Take a look at this first situation. I have a surface area of 6 millimeters squared and a volume of 1 millimeter cubed. This is a 6:1 ratio. So I have a lot of surface area to allow me to diffuse nutrients into the cell while getting rid of waste particles out of the cell. But watch what happens when I increase the size of the cell. Now it's double the length and double the width and double the height, giving me a surface area of 24 millimeters squared and a volume of 8 millimeter cubed. This is a 3:1 ratio. And now I have less surface area with which to diffuse food and nutrients in, and of course to get rid of waste. So it's a lot more difficult for this cell to survive than for this cell. And as we get bigger and bigger, our surface area to volume ratio decreases significantly. Eventually you get to the point where nutrients are not coming in fast enough and waste is not getting out fast enough. Either the cell will starve or toxic waste will begin to build up and poison it. This is why nature does not create large single-cell organisms, opting instead to create large multicellular organisms. Now, if you recall, diffusion is the random movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. We say this is a concentration gradient. So if you have a lot of nutrients outside of the cell and very little nutrients inside the cell, diffusion will allow these nutrients to move across the barrier to fill it up and equalize it. Of course, the opposite is true. If you have too much waste products inside the cell and not a lot of waste outside the cell, the waste products will naturally diffuse out the cell membrane in order to equalize the two. And so cells rely on diffusion to bring many nutrients through their selectively permeable membrane. This is known as passive transport, because this happens automatically without the cell having to expend energy to make the nutrients diffuse in and the toxic waste to diffuse out. And so when the surface area to volume ratio becomes too small, diffusion alone cannot support the cell's nutrients needs anymore. As such, a cell's size is restricted by its surface area. The largest unicellular organism in the world is the Valonia ventricosa, which typically grows from 1 cm to 4 centimeters in diameter. Anything larger than this, and it just becomes impractical for that cell or for that creature to survive. A society relies on its specialists to function efficiently and properly. I wouldn't trust my gardener to be my doctor, and I definitely would not trust my doctor to be my gardener. Every time I visit my doctor, he's got a brand new plant because he just can't keep them alive. Thankfully, he's better at keeping humans alive than he is at plants. So each profession specializes in the job that they do, but no single profession is the best at everything. Similarly, a multicellular organism relies on different types of cells to function efficiently and properly. So here we have blood cells, bone cells, muscle cells, neuron cells. Each of these cell types is designed specifically to do their job the best that they can, which is why you're going to hear me say the phrase form follows function quite a bit during this unit, because the form, the shape, the structure of each of these cells determines and dictates what function it has inside the body. So blood cells are shaped this way in order to maximize their ability to carry oxygen molecules. Bone cells are shaped this way in order to give them a strong structure, thus protecting your soft organs and giving your body a shape. Muscle cells tend to be long and thin. This is so they can stretch and pull, while neurons are designed to receive and transmit information. So a specialized cell is a cell that can perform a specific function. In order to effectively perform their specialized functions, cells have developed specific physical and chemical characteristics that best suit their role. Again, form follows function. Muscle cells require large amounts of energy, thus they contain a lot of mitochondria, while cells that produce mucus in the intestine have a lot of Golgi bodies in order to package and release that mucus. So what I need you to do is read pages 58 to 60 and write a brief description of the various types of cells that are found in animals and plants. Now when it comes to unicellular organisms, so that'd be single-celled organisms, such as bacteria or algae, they are able to function independently without the direct help of other cells. So you can leave bacteria on the table by itself or algae in a pond by itself and they can survive on their own. They don't need other cells to survive. But with specialized cells that live within multicellular organisms, they would not survive long if they became separated from their surrounding cells. So let's say I had a nosebleed and I used a Kleenex to wipe it up. Well, the blood cells on that Kleenex would not be able to survive very long on their own. Or if I scraped my knee and I left some skin behind on the pavement, that skin cell will not be able to survive for long. Because of their specialization, they are designed to do one job very well, but that same specialization prevents them from doing a good job in other situations. And so cells within a multicellular organism are organized into a hierarchy. So they're organized in different levels, with the least complex structures at the very bottom and the most complex ones at the top. So we start off with the most simplest structure, and that's the atom. Atoms work together to create a molecule. Molecules work together to form a large macromolecule. Large macromolecules come together to become organelles. A bunch of organelles come together to become a cell. A bunch of cells working together are called tissues. Different tissues that work together are called organs. Different organs that work together are called organ systems. And finally, when you have a bunch of organ systems working together, we have the organism. And only by working together as a whole organism can these specialized cells survive and reproduce. So the cells in the stomach rely on the cells in the lungs to give it oxygen. Meanwhile, the cells in the lungs rely on the cells in the stomach to help give it nutrients. Every cell, tissue, and organ is working together to keep each other alive and, of course, the organism as a whole alive. Now, a tissue is a collection of similar cells that perform a specific function. In animals, there are 4 types, and these are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. So read over this chart, make sure you know a few examples of each type of tissue, and make sure you know the characteristics and functions of each type of tissue. Now, different tissues working together to perform a complex body function are called organs. Common organs in animals include the heart, stomach, lungs, kidneys, livers, eyes, etc., etc. The tissues in each of these organs work together to perform a specific function. An organ system is one or more organs and structures that work together to perform a major vital body function, such as digestion or reproduction. Most organs work within a single organ system. So for instance, the stomach is part of the digestive system. Its job is to break down and absorb nutrients, but that's all. However, some organs may play a role in more than one system. So for instance, the pancreas. It's part of the digestive system as well as the endocrine system, which is responsible for regulating the body by secreting hormones into the bloodstream. Common organ systems include the musculoskeletal, the respiratory, urinary, digestive, reproductive, circulatory, and nervous systems. Now, when we're born, our cells are not specialists right from the start. All multicellular organisms begin life as a single-cell zygote. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. This fertilized egg undergoes a series of cell divisions, and the cells are said to be in the process of cellular differentiation. This is when they start to show specialization in their shape, contents, and function. Once we start to see enough differentiation, we say the zygote is called an embryo. Now take a look at all these different embryos. During the early stages of development, many vertebrates, so vertebrates are animals with a backbone, well, many of these embryonic vertebrates have remarkably similar forms and structures. I mean, just looking at this, can you tell the difference in which type of animal they're going to be? This will eventually turn into a fish, while this will eventually turn into a rabbit, and this eventually turns into a human. And yet all these embryos look very similar to each other, despite, in the end, looking very different from each other. This is evidence from an evolutionary standpoint that we all came from a common ancestor. And through evolution, some get to keep their gills because they evolved to live in the water, while our embryos evolved to live on land. So our early gill structures do not develop any further. This is pretty cool stuff. If you want to know more, take grade 11 biology. In animal cells, a cell that can differentiate into many different types of cells is called a stem cell. Just like the different branches on a tree that stem off, these stem cells can eventually turn into so many different things. Depending on the type of nutrients it receives and other environmental factors, different parts of its DNA can be turned on or off. So remember, every one of these cells has a complete set of DNA, a complete set of instructions to show it how to build everything in your body, even if it doesn't need to build it. and that's why the DNA can be turned on or off. And by turning on or off different regions, we start to form specific types of cells and tissues. Now, if you look at this stage over here, I believe this one's called a blastocyst stage. Eventually, when it implants itself or attaches itself to the uterus, these different layers will start to differentiate into different parts of the body. So starting from a zygote, which will eventually become every cell in your body, we start to see some differentiation. These guys over here will eventually become sperm or eggs, while these ones will eventually become skin or brain tissue. Because they can turn into so many different types of tissue, we call them stem cells because they can branch off into different possibilities. In general, there are two types of stem cells. With embryonic stem cells, they are at such an early stage in development, there are so many different possibilities they could eventually become. While tissue or adult stem cells are found later in life from cells that have already started to specialize. Because they've already developed along a certain path, these cells can only differentiate into a few types of cells. So the earlier you catch them, the more different types of cells they can become, while the later you catch them, the fewer options they have. Now, tissue stem cells from bone marrow can differentiate into white blood cells, red blood cells, or platelets. This procedure is often used to treat patients with leukemia or other cancers that affect blood cells. As a grade 10 student, you're probably not old enough to join the One Match network yet. But when you do become of age, I think 17 years old is the requirement, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you join One Match. It's pretty easy to join. Essentially, they take a swab of your cheek cells, analyze your DNA, and then put you in a database. Certain types of cancers, like leukemia, can be treated with stem cells. If your DNA matches up with a patient's DNA, they can then call you up and ask if you'd like to donate your stem cells. So joining One Match doesn't mean you have to donate. You can still say no if they call you up. If they call you up. I've been on this database for over 15 years and I've never been called. That's because there aren't too many Asians on the database. So if I ever develop leukemia, my chances of finding a match, someone who can help me out, someone who could cure my cancer, is very low. Minorities in North America are very underrepresented. But let's say they do call you up. Here's how it works. First, they'll harvest your stem cells from bone marrow or blood. They'll clean it up, process it, and get it ready to be injected into the patient. But first, the patient has to go through chemotherapy to destroy all the old bone marrow, the cancerous bone marrow that's no longer working properly. Once the patient has finished the chemotherapy, then they can inject your stem cells in, and because they are stem cells, they can grow to replace the bone marrow that was destroyed during chemotherapy, hopefully leaving the patient cured. So please, please, please consider joining One Match, especially if you are a part of an underrepresented population. So research in the field of stem cells holds great promise for organ and tissue transplants and regeneration. But it's not without its controversies. In order to study stem cells, the best supply are from embryos. And so there are some moral and ethical issues that need to be explored before we start experimenting with potential humans. But another source of stem cells comes from the umbilical cord. And some parents will have their child's umbilical cord stored in a blood bank for future use. Because my child is a mix of Chinese and Caucasian, there's almost a 0% chance of him finding a match if he ever develops leukemia. So I've stored some of his stem cells just in case he ever needs it later on.